Hey everyone, welcome back. Last time on the Thread of God, we took a look at Humphrey's attempt to address the distant starlight issue that creationists have with their model and saw how it was flawed and untenable. Today we're going to be moving on through the next 3 tweets in this thread. They have 3 videos and a handful of articles that we'll be addressing. But first we need to take a look at the tweet itself. Now, my regular audience is probably rolling their eyes by the second line, as I did, but for those who are not atheists, we need to clear up a couple of things here. While science can be considered to be a secular pursuit, there are many with relevant credentials in earth and life sciences who happen to be a follower of a particular religion, like Christianity, Islam, Hindu, etc. They understand and accept the evidence we have for evolution, the age of the earth, and the universe. Knowing what they do does not affect their belief in their chosen deities, but they do understand that the stories found in their sacred texts should not be taken literally. When someone believes by nothing but faith, it is a position held in lieu of evidence, and often is a position held in spite of evidence to the contrary. Faith in that context is something I don't rely on or use in my day-to-day life because I use past experiences and evidence to come to my decisions and conclusions. I have been misled before by what seemed like credible sources, and I will not let it happen again. So my standards have become much higher as it pertains to the burden of proof that claims must meet. Not so high that they're unattainable, but reasonably high. Now, asking how life started while discussing evolutionary biology does nothing but show that you, and no disrespect is intended here, but to be blunt, you don't know what you're talking about on the subject and have been misinformed by somebody. This happened either deliberately or because the source was misled themselves. If you get an answer of "I don't know" when you ask someone how life began, that is both honest and not really surprising. The study of abiogenesis is a series of overlapping and in some cases parallel hypotheses that still have parts which are under investigation. The reason abiogenesis is not considered a theory or part of evolution is because they study and investigate 2 completely different things. Abiogenesis investigates how life started, and evolution covers how that life changes and diversifies over time. Neither field of study is related or dependent on the other. With that out of the way, let's take a look at the first video, which is a clip from the film called Origin.
What are the odds a single protein could form exclusively through the blind interactions of chemistry? Our target is one smaller than average molecule made from 150 amino acids, each aligned to ensure a folded chain.
Now, since they are not specifying what molecule they're looking to make here, I'll just say it's a simple protein. Now, at the early stages of Earth history, 150 amino acids are not required to form this structure. As this article from Science Daily points out, as far back as 2013, we'd figured out that it looks like proteins could have started with just 10 amino acids.
Researchers have calculated that on the ancient Earth, the probability of success was 1 chance in 10 to the 164th power. That's 1 correctly sequenced protein chain for every 100 million trillion 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 failed attempts.
This numbers game is irritating for a few reasons. First is the fact that an impressive sounding number is easy to throw around if you don't include your variables or show your work, as they neglected to do here. That is pretty standard practice with these kinds of claims. Secondly, we have already established that functional protein molecules, which again I am assuming they're talking about here, could be formed with as little as 10 amino acids. That would cut this obscenely large number down considerably. Finally, these calculations are only ever applied to our planet, Earth, only, without taking into account the possibility of this happening on any of the other worlds we have found in orbit around the habitable zones of their stars, which are conducive to life as we know it here. When you factor that in and realize that every single time we try to impose a limit on life being possible here or there or under these conditions or those conditions, it always exceeds those expectations. So the odds of life forming have increased favorably rather than decreased. Regardless, we only have one data set to work with here, and that is our planet, so the odds were realistically a 50-50 shot with the data that we have. Everything from here on is meant to make the viewer focus on only the unlikelihood of life only forming on Earth. Again, the variables are not listed, and if you actually take a few into account, the odds do favor life. The whole scenario they posit for the odds makes it seem like it's outright impossible, which evidently isn't the case.
Now, suppose against all odds, chemical evolution produced our single functional protein. Would we have life? No. We'd have one protein, just a lifeless arrangement of amino acids. The simplest living cell we know has more than 300 different proteins. But proteins are only part of the story when you consider any actual cell. Remember, you're going to have carbohydrates, complex sugars, nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, lipids, a whole variety of different chemicals which jointly constitute the living state. Those bits and pieces all have to be brought into the same microenvironment at the same moment in time.
I really don't like that whole chemical evolution phrase because it can be so misleading if used in this context. Now, once again, and I cannot stress this enough, abiogenesis has absolutely nothing to do with the theory of evolution. Now, ignoring their erroneous odds of protein formation, there were other things forming besides just protein chains. Everything he talks about, in fact, with the exception of RNA and DNA, which came later, and all of them were in the same area when they were forming, so it isn't like they had to travel far to meet up. Since, like the proteins, the early precursors of all these structures were much simpler, the weird odds and comparisons they draw with modern molecules is misleading. The rest of the clip is just playing with the ridiculous odds that they've been using with the idea that the modern cell structure we have is the only thing that could be functional, while in reality, more primitive cells would have been absolutely fine back then, though they clearly cannot compete now. I will cover abiogenesis in more detail in my Your Next Period of Instruction series at a later date, as that will likely take up a couple of episodes. For the time being, I need to make it clear that these structures can and do form naturally. Though there are gaps in our knowledge of the exact process at some points, at no point is a creative agency needed or indicated. Moving on to the next tweet in the thread, we have articles from the ICR and a site called inplainsight.org. Obviously, neither of them is peer-reviewed, and we have a video to look at from AIG's site. No, I didn't accidentally pull two images from the same site. The articles are in fact titled in pretty much the same way. The first one by Morris does not start off strong at all. I'll explain. Mutation, which is indeed random, and natural selection are two distinct mechanisms of evolution. Natural selection was the first discovered by Darwin, but we know about a few more today. We'll focus on mutation and natural selection for this. As I mentioned earlier, mutations are random, and natural selection can favor developments resulting from them or weed them out if they are detrimental to the survival of the population. So the comparison to natural selection being some sort of sieve isn't actually incorrect and is an okay metaphor for the process. However, the main point in this next section of no beneficial mutations being found is completely false. There are three categories of mutations. Detrimental mutations are eliminated by natural selection pressures in a few generations, if not immediately. Neutral mutations, having no real impact on the survivability of the organism, are allowed to build up unrestricted until they provide some effect that natural selection can work with one way or the other, and make up the vast majority of mutations. Lastly, beneficial mutations, which provide some benefit to the organism to increase its survivability, which may eventually spread to the rest of the population. This article was released in 2003, so let's take a look at some data on beneficial mutations specific to us, which is much more recent. Specifically, a couple of mutations out of a few dozen or so that allowed the development of our greatest asset, our brains. Remember that evolution isn't about getting bigger, faster, or constantly gaining something. Losing something to streamline or specialize is also beneficial, and so is the trade-off that can sometimes come with that. Like the MYH16 gene, which encodes a protein called myosin heavy chain 16. Now, this protein is a component in the formation of massive jaw muscles in apes. We have this gene too, but it doesn't work in us. Humans have a mutation that inhibits the formation of the protein. Now, what does this have to do with human brain development? Well, if you look at the skulls of non-human apes, you'll see a bone protrusion at the top of the skull. That is the sagittal crest and is where the massive jaw muscles that these animals have anchor to, and that gives them their incredible bite force. And you'll notice that these muscles wrap around the entire skull. When these animals bite, they are exerting hundreds of pounds of pressure, and that force has to go somewhere. For this reason, the skulls suture up pretty quickly, which means the brain is limited in how much it can expand. But that isn't the case with us. We don't have those large muscles, so not only do we have considerably less bite force, but our skulls are free of that pressure, allowing a larger brain cavity and by extension a larger brain, both of which were caused by other mutations. Now bear in mind that this was a gradual development and was by no means instantaneous and started about 2.5 million years ago as indicated by the molecular clock and fossil remains after we diverged from what would eventually become chimps. Another key change was the encephalization or expansion of our brain size. This appears to be due primarily to a single mutation that allowed the formation of more brain neurons. As our brain size increased and our neocortex developed, we gained our impressive intelligence, the intelligence that sets us apart from all other apes. Anyway, those are a couple of obvious beneficial mutations, so let's get back to the article. Where were we? Oh, right, the odds of evolution. I'll roll with the numbers they give because it won't make a difference to the explanation. Evolution in these articles from the ICR, Discovery Institute, AIG, and such misrepresent evolution severely, to the point that they might as well just say that they think that individuals evolve. But that isn't the case. Populations evolve. Bearing in mind that between two siblings, like my own kids for example, they were born with about 120 unique mutations each that could make them taller or shorter, stronger or faster, etc. It works the same way across all populations, many of which have more offspring than we do. It was only in the last century that we started only having 2 or 3 children as compared to before that having families with 6 or 7 kids due to high child mortality rates. Now those 120 mutations unique to each individual mean that populations have far more opportunity to evolve, which means that the implied 1 or 2 offspring per pairing odds are erroneous and vastly over-exaggerated compared to the reality. Yes, it is true that not all lines will be successful, but there will be several that are. Mutations and the changes they cause happen gradually, but with so many individuals in the population being born and with natural selection in play, the ridiculous numbers put forth are nonsense exaggerations that ignore quite a lot. The last thing I want to touch on before moving on is this bit found in a section called Discussion after the article itself. The second law of thermodynamics, which always pops up at some point. The second law basically states that the total energy and heat of a closed system will slow down and cool down over time. Now this does not apply to evolution because the Earth is not a closed system since it is fueled by the energy from the sun, and life uses the energy to grow and replicate. This fact is the basis of the grade school explanation of the food chain, so it can't be used as an argument against evolution, especially since the guy that created the laws of thermodynamics, Lord Kelvin, knew full well and admitted that they posed no threat to Darwin's theory. So let's move on. The second article by David Holden looks to be considerably out of date, with its sources being from the early 80s to as late as 2001. This is another irritating numbers game that fails for the same reasons the last one did and leans very heavily on his incredulity. As in, he doesn't understand the science or think it's possible, therefore God must have done it. So I won't go through this just to repeat myself, which means we can move right into the next short video from AIG. This little gem features Mike Riddle, focusing on his own probability argument. Let's see what he has to say.
To do this, we'll use the origin of life, the first living cell. And to help illustrate this, we'll use just one of the components of a cell called a protein. Now, proteins are made up of what we call amino acids. Amino acids bond together to make biological proteins. So what we need to look at are the parameters that are involved in the formation of a single protein. And that will help us understand some of the probabilities involved in getting a single living cell.
As I thought, he tries to throw abiogenesis in with evolution, which, as I've already said, are not related to each other at all. At least he specifies what he's trying to calculate the probability of, though.
In making proteins. There's over 300 different types of amino acids out there, but only 20 are used in life. That means life is very selective. If we get one of these wrong amino acids, the protein may not function properly. It could be very damaging to our bodies.
Not necessarily. Only 20 are used now, but that doesn't mean that the other ones couldn't have been used at all. They may have formed viable proteins that simply weren't used, or were used in early protocells that went extinct for one reason or another.
A second probability problem deals with the shape of the amino acids. Amino acids come in 2 shapes. We call them left-handed amino acids and right-handed amino acids. And like our hands, they are mirror images of each other. Now here's the problem. Only left-handed amino acids are used in life. Right-handed ones are not used in life.
Not to nitpick here, but the term is chirality, not shape. Yes, there are left and right-handed amino acids, and we aren't sure why the left-handed amino acids won out, but even if they didn't, life could form from right-handed amino acids, and we would literally be having the same argument about chirality. As it stands, life as we know it formed from the left-handed variety, but that doesn't make it impossible for life to form from the right-handed ones. It's just not compatible with life as we know it here.
The third problem deals with the order. These amino acids cannot be lined up in just any random order. They have to be in a very specific order so that protein can fold a specific way and perform its function. So the three problems we have here, number one, we can only use 20 of the over 300 amino acids that are available. Of those 20, we can only use the left-handed versions. And then they all must be in the correct order or that protein may not function properly.
Yes, amino acids need to link up in a particular order, but by ignoring all but 20 amino acids and only allowing for the left-handed chirality, while only calculating for it happening on Earth, is not realistic. As I pointed out earlier, failure to take into account the same process on other planets as if our world is mathematically the only planet capable of supporting life as we know it distorts the results. The rest of this video is more the same incredulity in pointing out the incredible odds. In all actuality, if you calculated the odds of all the events in my life that led up to me doing this video, you would come up with a number similar to the odds presented for life happening on this planet. Obviously, neither is impossible, no matter what the numbers say. So we have one more tweet to cover, and at this point you may be wondering why I insisted on powering through all three of these. Partly because I know that the sources provided so far will be repeating themselves, but mostly to get to the part of this thread I've been both eager to and dreading covering. The man that seems to be responsible for providing most, if not all, of the misinformation that this kid who wrote this thread believes. More on that in a bit, though. Let's finish up here. So, as for the tweet itself, there is absolutely no research in genetics that I have ever seen that supports young Earth creationism or creationism in general. And we saw some of that when we looked at those peer-reviewed articles a while back. There's also a huge contradiction here with literally everything we've talked about so far. As we already covered, proteins are formed from amino acids, and they preceded both RNA and DNA, both of which can encode for proteins as well. So either he didn't read or watch his sources or didn't pay attention at all. Otherwise, this glaring contradiction would have been apparent. Now, the first link is to a YouTube video from this gentleman, which is called The Amazing Rib.
We all know the story of Adam and Eve. Adam was created from the dust of the ground, and Eve was created from a rib bone from man. Now, my question was always, why didn't God just use the dust of the earth again to create woman?
Didn't he create Lilith from the earth too? Pretty sure that according to rabbinic texts, Lilith, Adam's first wife, wanted to be equals, but Adam wasn't cool with that. So after she left Adam for being too controlling, God magicked him up a subservient woman from his rib because I guess that would make her an extension of Adam and put her under his control or something like that. I don't really remember the reasoning. It's like asking me to remember why Odin got crucified.
First, let's look at a very interesting fact. I was always curious about this. You know, if man is from the dust of the ground, really, then the components of man should be what's in the dust of the ground. Now, you can look this up anywhere, but here are the elements present in the human body. And in the Bible verse says, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." These are the components you'll find in your body. It's amazing what's in there. I mean, things like iron and, bromine and lead and just all kinds of different things. Of course, oxygen is by far the biggest component. But what's interesting is all of these, every single one of them, can be found in the minerals on the surface of the ground. Now, it literally appears as if God, and I have no idea, this is just some picture I drew, but it looks like literally he could have reached down into the crust of the earth and come up with the chemicals needed. Now, I'm not saying literally just reach in there, but they're there. They're right here on the surface of the ground. Every chemical component, every element, I should say, that's in your body.
No kidding. Imagine that. We have some of the most common and abundant elements incorporated into our bodies? Is this the proof that I've been looking for that God exists? No, absolutely not. I know why and how those elements were incorporated thanks to science, and I don't need a magical explanation. I will do a video on that specifically at some point, but this was cited as some kind of genetic proof for God.
There are 206 bones in the human body. 206. Only one, let me restate that, only one out of 206 will regrow if surgically removed correctly. You guessed it, the rib. One. Now think about that. 205 other choices. Now how did Moses know that the one bone that he would actually say that God had taken from the man to make woman, how would he know that's the one bone that would be able to regrow itself?
Setting aside that Moses is a fictional character that never existed, yes, the rib, if properly removed, will regenerate, but only if the perichondrium, a sheath surrounding the rib cartilage, remains. Without it, the rib won't grow back. The sheath has stem cells that are used for this regeneration process. If you notice the way he worded that whole thing about only one rib being able to do this or being capable of it, so did I, and to his credit, he did make a note of his error. Now, the ribs are the only bones capable of this in humans and other mammals. The other bones can heal from a break, but they don't have the ability to regenerate whole like the rib does. Anyone else getting hungry? All this talk about ribs is making me want some barbecue. Ribs.
I'm just a regular person, but when someone causes someone to become so sleepy that you're able to remove a rib, to me that's called a surgery, and that's called anesthesia.
He's trying to insert modern knowledge into his interpretation of mythology here. The story of the formation of Eve is based on part of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Enkidu has several injuries healed by women created to heal those wounds, including one specifically made to heal the wound in his side, though her name eludes me for the moment and I can't find my copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh. I need to read it again.
Bone marrow transplantation. I don't know if you're familiar with it. My brother's a bone marrow transplant specialist. I don't have a lot of knowledge in that area, but what I do know is that bone marrow can actually be infused back into your body and can help regrow other organs and to regrow damaged organs. Yeah, like I say, you have to Google bone marrow transplant. But when you do that, you'll find there are 5 common donor sites. If you were going to get bone marrow from a subject, there are 5 donor spots. The cranium, or the skull, the sternum, the vertebrae in the back, the pelvis, and you guessed it, the rib. Now, there's also some evidence that some of the bigger bones, such as the leg bone and certain bones here, can also work too. But the biggest donor sites, and you can look this up on the internet, look up where does bone marrow transplants come from. And every place you find, I guarantee you, this baby will be there. There'll probably be about 4 or 5 donor areas, and one of them's the rib.
Your brother either gave you some bad information or you completely misunderstood him. Yes, bone marrow transplants can be used to replace damaged or destroyed marrow from things like radiation treatments, for example, by extracting stem cells for the formation of blood cells from a donor and implanting them in the recipient. However, it cannot currently be used to regrow organs, though the potential is there due to the very nature of stem cells. They may one day be repurposed for humans for regenerative purposes, but right now it's only been done in animal trials in China, with treatments that primarily deal with cardiovascular ailments from what I've been able to find. So it's more of a limited proof of concept than an actual thing that can be done right now. As for the harvesting sites, you are again wrong. The rib is not listed in any place that I have found as a valid extraction site. The most common sites are the sternum and the hips, with the femur being another option for extraction in a pinch. The places you named do have marrow in them, but that's it. They are not all extraction sites. And again, the stem cells found in bone marrow are specialized for the formation of blood cells. They are not some kind of universal cell and are very limited in their application. They certainly cannot be used to regrow any organ. not currently at any rate. I also want to make it clear, again, that he is inserting current medical knowledge into his biblical interpretation without justification. The rest of the video is a recap of what we already covered after a bit where he talks about the potential of the stem cells being able to regrow a human body in God's hands. None of this proves a God or any kind of advanced knowledge. At best, the writers didn't see an issue with a human missing a single rib and chose it for that reason as opposed to any other bone in the body. I'll link the video below along with the other sources. So we finally got past the videos, and now we only have 3 articles left to look at. Up first is another article from the ICR. This one is talking about the ENCODE project that was started in 2003 as a direct follow-up to the Human Genome Project. The goal of the project is to figure out the role of the majority of the genome that has been largely regarded as junk. They reported in 2012 that 80% of the human genome has biochemical function, meaning that it serves a purpose and is therefore not junk. This is a prime example of why the peer review process exists and works. The number they gave is so far out of the realm of calculated functional DNA that it was checked out and problems were found. For example, the project used a rather loose definition of functional that included anything that is transcribed but is non-functional. Now, admittedly, they were looking for biomedically relevant sections, like those dealing with epigenetic gene expressions, but the way they worded it could have been better. Functional DNA is not immune to mutation any more than other sections anyway, but those changes will only be conserved if they provide some selective advantage for the organism, and eventually part of the population as an extension of that. And that is only if it isn't overridden or suppressed in future generations. This is one reason that I really don't like it when science sensationalizes discoveries by accident. Organizations like the ICR pick it up without knowing what they're talking about or what the implications are and don't bother to report what happens after the fact accurately. This next article is another such example of sensationalized reporting. Not knowing exactly what long strands of RNA do in mice doesn't mean it's worthless or junk, as it could serve some purpose that is conditional, like the epigenetic sections in the last article. Junk is completely non-functional, and the term for functional seems to be used rather loosely here as well. This last article can be misleading if you don't have a proper understanding of genetics. It is not possible that we came as a species from a single pair of people. There simply is not enough genetic diversity to allow that, and it would result in extinction in just a few generations. What is indicated, however, is that the genetic lineage of 2 people continued to be present throughout that time. In other words, the genetic traits that began in them carried on through to this day, which means that there was a viable population that those genes could spread into. It may have been a small population, but that isn't unexpected, as there are signs of at least 3 genetic bottlenecks, usually due to a migration of one group away from the ancestral area in our own lineage. This is why it holds with evolutionary theory and does nothing to change our understanding of it or disprove it in any way. This article says the same thing happened to multiple species, and again, the wording is misleading. The calamity that caused this bottleneck isn't currently known to the best of my knowledge, and the time frame is right when anatomically modern humans appeared, so there were still several subspecies of Homo around then. And we know that there was some interbreeding with a couple of those groups. Though it doesn't specify which group these indications came from, it is possible that those genetics came from one of the other sister species. So there's no Adam and Eve scenario here, despite what it may sound like. Now, I think this image he included with the tweet is talking about the last article, which shows that he didn't read it or understand it. Science has already developed and uses the molecular clock, which uses the steady and predictable mutation rates of mitochondrial DNA, the parts inherited from the mother, to estimate when changes in the genome occurred. This is then corroborated with independent dating methods like radiometric isotope dating, and they correlate within an acceptable margin of error. The results do, in fact, support evolution consistently. Since we know that all life on Earth can trace its origins back to early forms of life, this common ancestry means it really isn't surprising that all life on Earth is around the same age. We are part of nature, not something created apart from it. So that takes care of the 3 tweets I wanted to get through in this episode. And the reason I pushed through all of this is because this is what we're going to be covering next.
I'm going to show you 100 reasons why evolution is so stupid.
That's right, Hovind is included as a source. I'm not the first one to cover this video in particular. Logic made an outstanding series on it, for example, but since it is included in this thread, I will be covering it myself. As a preface to that, I want to go ahead and address his 6 divisions of evolution. Now, as my regular audience and anyone who is involved in debating creationists knows, these 6 divisions are inaccurate. For those not familiar with why, I will explain. The use of the word evolution as it pertains to the theory of evolution is specific to biology and does not include everything here under an umbrella term like he's using it. This is a setup to employ the false equivalence and false dichotomy fallacies. He's using the word evolution in the sense of any change over time and equivocating that to the theory itself, so he can erroneously cram several fields of science in as well. Now, starting with cosmic evolution, this is indeed the Big Bang Theory, which is the scientific explanation of the origin and development of the universe. Chemical evolution is covered by the theory of stellar nucleosynthesis, which explains how the elements are made in the fusion that fuels stars. Stellar and planetary evolution, which is better worded as star and planet formation, is covered by 2 theories: nebular theory for the formation of stars, and the core accretion theory for the formation of planets. Organic evolution is covered by abiogenesis, which is not yet a scientific theory, but has evidentiary support in each of the several hypotheses associated with it. Now, none of these, up to this point, has anything to do with the theory of evolution in any way. The last 2 here, macro and microevolution, are both part of the same theory of biodiversity, and both have been observed, though you have to realize that the way he uses the word kind here is deceptive and useless in a discussion of biology and taxonomy. Macroevolution is the formation of new species, which means that enough genetic diversity has built up between 2 populations that were once part of the same group that they no longer interbreed or are incapable of doing so. Once that happens, new species are formed, which has been directly observed several times, like the formation of a new species of finch in the Galapagos, for example. Yes, it is still a finch, but at no point does the theory of evolution demand that anything give birth to something that is fundamentally different from what the parents are, like a dog giving birth to a cat, for example, which is both impossible and not evolution. Microevolution is the variation that Darwin spoke of within species, which is where we get things like breeds of dogs that are still interfertile with each other. That too has also been observed, obviously. I'll be covering these theories in more detail in my Your Next Period of Instruction series. Now, while scripting this, I apparently got under Hovind's skin with a comment I made on one of his Whack an Atheist videos, as he has challenged me to a debate on his channel. I'd be happy to do a debate with him, but not on his channel, as I don't trust him at all to represent me honestly, or what I say for that matter. And I don't feel like letting him gish gallop away for 20 minutes or so. It would have to be through a neutral party like modern day debate, as they have a structure that has the opening statements and then a conversation back and forth, which is what I would prefer to do with him. So keep an eye out for that maybe happening in the future. Anyway, I'll be covering his video here starting next time. Until then, stay curious.